Good morning, everyone. Thank you for making the time this morning to conclude our one-year process of this effort and to upgrade the city's policies and benefit taxpayers with revised approaches to special assessments. So with that, we'll take the roll call first.
Jim Bullis.
Here.
Kent Busick. Gloria Palm Connor. John Cosgriff.
Here.
Don Dabbert. Bernie Dardis.
Here.
Tony Garrick. Tony Grinberg.
Here.
Christy Fremstead.
Here.
Kurt Grosky.
Here.
Kevin Hansen.
Here.
Jeff Volk.
Here.
Bill Worth.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Is there a motion on the minutes from the previous meeting?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Same sign, motion carried. Based on the feedback that we had primarily after both public forums on the special assessments, the desire was obviously to have a final meeting, review the feedback from the public forum, as well as the feedback from social media that was put online by city staff. Questions about Prairie Dog was also raised about early on in our process, whether that was going to become real. The fact is that it has. In your packet is a lot of information on the legislation, some background. Certainly going to have discussion on that as well. And then a culmination of options that were listed in the email that went Friday from trying to put into three buckets: financial, administrative, and transparency. Gloria has submitted her ideas as well, and Mr. Volk as well. So I would ask each of you, when we get to that agenda item, to walk through and explain your thoughts, and then we'll just go through each agenda item if that seems appropriate and have discussion. I would like to have a special thanks to Greg and Ty with city staff. I don't see Ty or Greg here this morning. They worked very hard on putting the survey together, putting the information and producing the document that you have today that was sent Friday. And I want to give them special thanks because that was a lot of work to pull that together and produce that report. So with that, I'd open up for discussion and your thoughts, your takeaways from all three surveys, I guess, yours, the feedback from those that attended the two public forums, as well as the online, which we've tried to separate to give you a perspective of how each group came in and from a standpoint of information and feedback. So. Gloria?
My overwhelming takeaway is that the task force is almost completely opposite of what the public is saying on almost every question, which isn't a complete surprise, I don't think, to anyone, that they feel there should be another means rather than special assessments for most of the infrastructure.
Mr. Volk?
Concur that clearly the color charts are different colors for the different groups. I've got a pretty big concern on the low number of responses on the web. I don't look at that as a real scientific way to capture data. And I'm going to relate it to my experience developing infrastructure is traditionally, and I look at the comment that somebody else should pay is kind of the same as let's not build a project, so the naysayers always show up in force, and you got to kind of sort through that, and it's usually a real small subsection of the total. So it's really difficult to get the pulse. What is the overall public really thinking? So I was disappointed at the low turnout, the low responses, and it represents such a small percentage of the total population that I go, is it really something that it obviously didn't weigh my thoughts as I rolled out the paper I put together.
Mayor Dardis?
West Fargo's public engagement forms was very similar. We had a few more responses, both online and that actually showed up for the meetings. But yeah, there's a commonality. You're both right, and that is that some of the folks that did engage, that did come to the public forums, were there for a reason. They had a specific issue that they wanted to talk about, and they were angry about their assessment or whatever. And that's always positive to have people have that opportunity to come out and express that. But I think one has to be very careful how some of that public input comes in as an overall as to what the community is thinking.
I agree with everything you guys say, but when you look at the other communities in the United States, I did quite a bit of research online trying to find other communities that do specials like Fargo or the state of North Dakota in general. There are not very many out there. So the public in those locations are saying the same thing everybody in Fargo is saying that responded. Specials are not the way to pay for roads. That's the overwhelming, if you look at the true amount of data that's out there, that's the overwhelming, in my opinion, response from the citizens of the United States. I looked at the response for the St. Paul, because they switched recently, and they had a major uproar, at least per the paper, that nobody wants to pay for it that way. There are plenty of other ways to do it. We just have to choose the other ways.
Jim?
Yeah, and this is no surprise. I've said this since the get-go, and I think that the data from the public is, bears this out. I think it's time the city gets out of the greenfield special assessment business. If we're going to make any changes here, if this work for the last 12 months that we've done is going to amount to anything, we have to make a decision to start eliminating part of the problem. And I think we know that the specials are not the long-term solution. At some point, we have to cut the cord. And I think when I sort of smiled when I saw the results, because I think that the taxpayers are at the point where they look at the specials and not just the initial specials for greenfield developments, but all the adders, the streetlights a mile away, all the little things. We can never tell anyone what specials are going to be because it always changes. And I think that, especially in conjunction with the prairie dog money, we have an opportunity here to get out of to let people have some certainty that their taxes are going to be just their general taxes and move on.
Yeah, just Kevin.
I would just say that, I agree that the numbers are a little disappointing, but I don't want to be careful discounting it. There's a reason we have the special task force. There was an issue brought up, so obviously there are some concerns. And I think it'd be a mistake on this committee's part not to come forth with some recommendations that have some significant change, just not, a little wording change here and there. I think it needs to be a significant change. At least that should be an option to the commissioners to look at.
Yeah, I would concur, just as a comment to Jim and Kevin, prairie dog's a game changer as far as, the impact it's going to have on taxpayers. In my opinion, applying those dollars to greenfields is not going to be a solution when you look at the history and the benefit of a new development versus applying those dollars to existing neighborhoods and reconstruction. I think largely that's what the intent of the legislature is. And then there's a philosophical belief whether you want to do that in greenfields, and I get that. But to Kevin's point as well, that's what, primarily what we need to come out today with your ideas to get to a list that have options that are substantive. And then also, I believe cover these three categories so that when the policy is amended, we can say, here's what the major impacts and the changes are, and here's what the other, things you've talked about to move us forward. Jim?
And Mr. Chairman, I didn't mean to suggest that we use the prairie dog money for greenfield developments. I sort of mean, I think we need to just cut the cord on financing new developments. You can use that prairie dog money for the rehab and for arterials and give the ability to take away all these small add-on special assessments, really for everybody.
I agree with you, Jim, but I think we need to do it gradually, over a period of time because of the impact it'll have on current housing. One of my recommendation was that, we actually get out of, non-critical infrastructure in new developments and just focus primarily on the critical infrastructure, the streets, the curbs, sewer and water, and then figure out additional ways to, over time, transition out of it.
Jeff?
I know we've got Prairie Dog a little later on the agenda, but it's on the table. So I've got a real concern that Prairie Dog not be considered the alternative to specials, because there's no assurance Prairie Dog's here forever. And I think we need to come up with a practice that as funding sources come and go, that supplement, we still have a practice and a policy that manages infrastructure financing that is pliable, that works, even if there's less funding that comes from outside the region, and you still have a method then in place that you don't have to completely retool how you're paying for infrastructure. So while it's kind of sweet, it's here. I'm not convinced it's here forever. And so we better not set a practice that assumes it's here forever. I think we're going to just create heartburn big time in the future. So I think we got to figure out how to have a practice and a policy that has some life to it, regardless of the revenue streams, whether it's income, sales tax, property tax, Prairie Dog, state funding, whatever it is, those things are going to go up and down, and you need to kind of have a balance.
John and then Don?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Jeff, I agree with you. The question I always ask people when they say, get rid of special assessments, and the next question you have to ask is, how do you want to pay for it? And they don't. And so it's really easy to be against special assessments when the replacement for those dollars is somebody else pays. And so Prairie Dog can probably alleviate the specials, but I found that when you're having a real discussion with people and say, how are we going to do these things? How are we going to pay for it? Do you want to do utility fees? Do you want to do street fees? What do you want to do? And then you start to have the real conversation is that it becomes synonymous. Doing away with special assessments means there's no cost to me as a homeowner, and that's fallacy. We have to pay for our streets. We have to pay for our infrastructure. And I've always looked at this discussion as this is a financing discussion. It's how we're paying for those. We can do some things, and when we go back and look in the survey, this group did look at ways to try and pull down the cost, which drives what the special assessments will be. And I think the city does a good job and should continue to work on that. But what we really need to have the discussion with the public is, how do you want to pay for this? It's not going away. It has to be repaired. It has to be maintained. What do you think the best way is to pay for that? I think it's special assessments because the law requires that you show a direct connection between the property that's paying the special assessment and the improvement. If we move to other things, that connection will leave us. And I would rather to see a very, very specific connection between those projects. So, to me, we continue to need to educate. First time I sat on a task force like this, we said the same thing. We didn't do a very good job, and we still haven't done a very good job. But if you'll spend the time with people and talk to them and say, the cost of the infrastructure is the cost of the infrastructure. How we're going to pay for it is what we're talking about here.
Don?
I'll just echo some of those points that John made, but it's a little bit of a false notion that the other areas in the country don't have some form of financing mechanism. It's by a different name, whether it's an impact fee, other form of an assessment either paid by the developer or the homeowner. But I think to John's point, at some time, somebody has to pay the bill. And this is a financing mechanism. I think a certain, with some of the proposals that have been laid out, I think there's room for improvement to make some big impacts and to find some cost sharing with the city for the arterials and other things. I've said before that a homeowner expects to have to pay for that street in front of their home in some fashion, whether it's in the lot without special assessments. What they have the biggest heartburn about is what Mr. Bullis alluded to, is paying for a street light nearly a half mile away. If you're essentially in the center of the section, you could be paying for, still half of that north-south and half of an east-west street. And if we could get to a point where there would either be some other form of financing of cost sharing, not borne directly by that resident or that property owner in that section, I think that would be a very happy compromise, and I could feel comfortable and confident we walked away here and made some significant changes.
Christie, you have that look.
I am curious about the arterial roads and how prairie dog funding is going to help that. Or is that going to change? I'm just curious about that. I think, to me, the prairie dog funding is just, at this point, a name. We haven't divided it up. We don't know that it's going to be here forever. So if we're changing things and we're saying today it's going to affect this, but tomorrow it's not, I'm concerned about that. But I'm also concerned about the impact that arterial roads have on residents all over the city.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that, a couple points. My takeaway from the public forums was arterials. Our conversation has been arterials. Commissioner Strand and I had coffee with former City Finance Director Mark Thielen on his perspective on this topic, and he brought up arterials. And he also was very passionate that, greenfields is something the city's business should be in, so that there's a level playing field. And so it was just an interesting conversation. I know Commissioner Strand and I, kind of talked about the arterial impact, as well as, you've expressed that throughout, this task force effort, as well as what was conveyed, at the public forum. So I think arterials is going to resonate high at the city commission level, and even with staff development on moving forward with policy recommendations, in my opinion.
I just don't understand how we make a recommendation without knowing the financing on the backside. I mean, it's easy to say, yeah, let's do it. But if we don't say that, yeah, we can do this, but this is how we're going to pay for it, it seems like it'll fail.
Yeah, help me through that, or help us through that a little more.
If we don't put some kind of a percentage on it, or say that we're going to change the percentage so we do have a financing mechanism to pay for those arterial roads, instead of just saying, yeah, we should change it. I'm just concerned that it's kind of too wide open and we don't have a more black and white. Maybe Dan, you can.
Yeah, I was thinking Dan or Brenda, if you have a comment or thought on that.
So I guess Tony and I have had this conversation previous to this meeting, and our hopes are that you're going to give us a high-level goal of these are the things we would like you to work on to try and reduce, and then we'll go back, because we're going to have to go back and look at our 4-year CIP and financially see what that impact is on different scenarios for the arterials, if that is something that this committee would like us to take a look at. And so I think our hope is high level, there would be some goals set of what you'd like to see done that could go to the commission, and then we could start doing some work and hammer in to the exact details and look at, what could that look like? But that's gonna be a long process. So that was kind of my hope.
So Brenda, at the end of the day, with a list and staff work from today's meeting, ultimately would get to address specifics to Christie's question.
Correct. You know, our thought is, you know, you kind of go through and hit the high level areas of, okay, we think we need to reevaluate how we're doing arterials for one. Let's say that's the example. Then what we would go back and do is, you know, take a look, give you a timeline of when we think we could have some ideas, because we are going to have to do some runs on each of those projects to really understand the financial impact of what that will look like. And then the commission's going to have to decide, can we do that financially or not?
Bernie?
All good discussion. Having been involved in the legislative process for the Prairie Dog Bill and testified both in the Senate and the House numerous times during the last legislative session, we need to understand how important it is for staff and elected officials that what we do with this money that's been allotted to each of our communities, our townships, our counties, and all of that, that we be absolutely good stewards with this. The whole, if you will, this whole state of North Dakota is watching this. And just this past week, Thursday and Friday, I had numerous phone calls and discussions with the mayor of Bismarck, Steve Bakken. Wanted to have discussions on what this group has been talking about and what our community in our public forums are. And discussions, you know, obviously they're trying to work to a monthly fee type thing, and they have apparently got a little approval from the legislature as a pilot program or something to study that more in depthly. But make no mistake, you know, the report for staff, when this money gets spent, is a one-page report. It's very simple. And I credit Senator Wardner, Representative Nathy, Representative Trotter, all those guys. They made it extremely simple in the sense that this is what the money can be spent for. There's 10 items on the list. Spend the money there, report it to the state, and we'll consider it. Now, there was a faction in the legislature that wanted a sunset clause on it. Okay, we debated that out of the question. But make no mistake, the decisions that we make have to be meaningful of how this money is going to be spent, as to how it's going to affect the taxpayers, or we won't have it in another biennium. That's my opinion.
I would concur with that, and the report should be black and white, how it benefited individual property taxpayers and specials by, you know, improvement projects.
So if we're just going to talk about a general levy going down, I don't think that will be viewed well by the legislature. I think if you can get into the specifics as to whether it's, you know, refurbishing and things like that, there's a certain percentage of what the cities are taking over versus what the taxpayers are paying, that will be significant.
I'm going to call on Kent, but before we do that, I'd like our Kent, City Fargo Kent, to come up and describe what he shared with me on a new transparency approach that you can list all these items as an idea that would get to your point, Bernie. Kent?
Question for Mayor Dardis. Based on your conversations with the Bismarck mayor, any impact or feedback as to how their funding has been working? Because they've been doing that for about the past year with the monthly fees.
I think that they're still struggling with, you know, the differential between the monthly fee versus, you know, those that are still being special assessed. And I think that they're getting some pushback on that. And so it's a little bit difficult at this juncture. But, you know, the fact that, you know, that it was interesting that Mayor Bakken called, because the largest benefactor of the Prairie Dog Bill is the city of Fargo. The second largest is the city of Bismarck. The third largest is the city of West Fargo, because of the growth factors that were used as multipliers. I don't think that they have a total conclusion, I know that they really like the idea, and apparently the public engagement has been positive to that. Now, when we use that as an example during our public forums about the monthly payment fee type thing, and it was a resounding no that they did, on those folks that were coming to our meetings, they didn't like the idea. But for, and at that time, Bismarck had, the number that they had captured looking at their population base was $25 a month. And, but those of our folks that we explained to at the public forums were not receptive to the idea at all.
Ken?
Yes, thank you. Commissioner, one of the items that we talked about, at least at the staff level, was the communication part of the process when those notices go out to the taxpayer. Basically, it starts at the end. It says, you have been assessed $5,000. Yada, 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 and notice, notice, notice. But we think it's important to try to lead the taxpayer along the process and along the story. Like, where did we start? What's the project? And maybe a little bit more meat and potatoes about what the project is. And then let's take them from gross cost, it's $10 million, minus the city contribution of $7 million, minus the prairie dog money of $1 million, and then the total project cost to be spread to all the people in the district would be X. Let's just call it $2 million. And oh, by the way, there's 5,000 parcels. This would be a large one, but there's 5,000 parcels in this district, and therefore your share is net. So that they have a basic understanding that this is a huge project, and there's a lot of people paying into the district. And I think that helps people understand and helps them get their head around what is it we're trying to accomplish with the project. Because if you just get a bill and it says, oh, you owe us $5,000, either pay it now or pay it over time, here's your interest rate. If you have a problem, call the city. I think we can do better in telling that story. And if it has to be a more graphic rendition instead of text, or if we can route them to the website so they can go to the website, clearly pull it up and get a really strong understanding of how this works. Because I think where we're getting gigged is we're not telling the whole story when we hand this arduous process off to the taxpayer. And it's no surprise that they're confused and they're maybe a little angry. It's like they don't have all the information, so how can they discern what it is we're asking of them? So that was one of the ideas that we had that was on one of our lists, was just to expand the notice and create more transparency in telling that story from the time it gets authorized, what's the expected cost, and then minus all the funding sources. I think that'll clear up a lot of the transparency issues and hopefully help everybody understand. And then also, when you think back to when, I think it was two or three sessions ago, when the legislature adopted that 12% property tax buy down, they were adamant, you will show this on the statement and you will show the impact of our buy down on that property tax statement. And that was significant because the taxpayers clearly understood what was happening and what happened to the buy down. And then when we went to the consolidated notices, that was an initiated measure. What I'm talking about is the consolidated notices of our tax hearings when we set our tax levies. That surfaced out of Cass County. Prior to the change in the law, each taxing entity sent a note that says we're going to have our tax hearings on this day, tax hearings on this day, your tax levy is this, your tax levy is that, 5 or 6 districts going on all at the same time. We confused the taxpayers. So now we changed the law, we got it through the legislature, they get one letter, they get 5 entities all feeding that letter, all saying what your tax burden is going to be. And I think it's just vastly superior communication about our tax policy and how we are going about setting our tax levies. So those are a couple of examples where we've enhanced the process through legislative means or through our own will. And so I think it's important to do the same type of process here. And staff would be happy to try to mock up some examples and create that, but I just want to share that with you.
I've got a quick question for you, Kent. On your example where you're saying the city's paying 7 million and the taxpayers are paying 2 and the Prairie Dog Fund is 1 million in this scenario, can you refresh my memory on where all of the 7 million is coming from that the city's paying now?
Well, and that was just arbitrary numbers, but
No, I
I mean,
understand.
it's either from the utility funds, water, wastewater, rate revenue, or it could be from our sales tax bucket, and our sales tax buckets are siloed into water, wastewater, and streets. So there's really like 5 main buckets of city money. There typically isn't any tax money that goes, or a tax levy, property tax money that goes into that. It's either sales tax or utility rates. So I mean, we can, instead of just saying, maybe this is where you're going, if we just say city funds and we don't identify them, you know, minus water, minus wastewater, minus sales tax, if you grow that list of resources, I think it sends a message to the taxpayer, oh, we really are adding a lot of money into this project, as opposed to just one line that says the city put in 7 million. So I think it's all in the communication process myself.
I guess I've heard comments from different people I've talked to that they believe it's coming from property tax, but you just said it's not.
And that's absolutely correct. I mean, I think in cases, because we're not spelling it all out, during the process of the assessments, all of that information is spelled out as it moves its way through the commission. There's an engineer's report of estimate, there's an identification of funding source, all of that moves through the system. But when we get to the end, then it's just punk, it's just a one-shot entry on your tax notice or your special assessment notice. And so I just think if we incorporate the data that's already been pulled together through the process of levying the assessments and share that with the taxpayers, that should help tremendously. I just think in people understanding, and then if they have a question about something, they should be questioning the data that's being presented as opposed to just, I don't like the $5,000 assessment.
Don?
And I think that'd be a huge step in the right direction. I question though whether the net assessment is $5 or $5,000. The fact that they're getting another special assessment notice in the mail for, I'll pick on the street light today because that seems to be the whipping post of the morning. But it's almost to the point that the whole specials fatigue and about that they just don't understand why they should have to be paid for something. I think it goes back to what is truly local and what is then maybe more arterial or collector or anything else with it. So I would really hope that we could find some means to separate those out as to where that is and to do that. But I think it's not necessarily in some cases the dollar amount, although that gets people more riled up, but the fact that they're still getting their assessment for something seems to get people pretty riled up.
Christie?
So Kent, you've been a valuable resource to me and to the committee, I think. My question is, and maybe I can be clearer, are you looking to us to give you an idea of where we think the percentages should fall? Like right now it's 70-30. Is that something that you're looking for, or?
Well, I don't think that's a staff ask at this point. I mean, policy development, policy setting clearly lies ultimately with the commission. We would certainly like the ability to study any recommendations that come forth and any changes off of our current policy. And it is all pretty much percentage-based right now. So if there is a departure from that, I think staff would want to have a shot at doing the analysis and making sure we're still going forward in a logical manner. So I'm kind of darting the question, or is staff asking? We were told at the start of this not to interject our ideas. So I'm holding firm to the directive that thou shalt not politic this process. And so I hope that answers your question.
And I'll add, a great question and point. Moving forward from today, a list of options, and then staff's going to have to go to work because there's a lot of detail, a lot of what ifs. If you do this, this will happen, and we're in the middle of our city budget for 2020, and I think any implications on the overall general fund budget versus the specials topic. During the public forums, we had illustrations, if you recall, 50-50, 70-30, which was changed last year, and then a 60-20-20, I think it was, to give you an illustration of what that might look like on a typical reconstruction. From my perspective, we're going to have $25 million of biennium to work with, $12.5 million a year of prairie dog money. So the impact of, Glory's thoughts, for example, of critical infrastructure only in greenfields, and then the impact and reduction of a burden to taxpayers by arterials, traffic lights. So is 70-30 acceptable at present, and all of that goes to arterials, which would have a profound impact on the assessment on really address arterials, or is it a blend? I think those are things, I think your question into Kent is, they're gonna have to come with some ideas. These are the what ifs. If you do this, this, and this, how it impacts the overall scheme of things. And that's how I would see it. Jeff?
If I may, and again, the prairie dog's later on the agenda, but it's,
I think we're all, I think we're in.
I understand, that wasn't a critical comment, but I was gonna hold some of my prairie dog thoughts to a little later, but I'm gonna throw them out now. As I think about funding, I look at the formula a little different. Again, I'm gonna go back to, in my opinion, prairie dog is new, and I don't know that it'll be here forever. I'm gonna suggest the concept we think about is prairie dog pay the first X percentage of a project. Now, this is 10% for math. I don't know if it's 10, 20, whatever the number is. The rest of the funding then follows current policy. So if it's 70-30, it's 70-30 of the non-prairie dog money. So you take it off the top and not the end. Having helped finance many projects in my life, as you start to drive everything to that last assessment number, and again, Kent, no criticism, the math Kent used was 70% traditional city money, 10% prairie dog, 20% assessment. Well, when prairie dog goes away, that's a really nice reduction in the beginning, right? It's a 33% reduction. But when it goes away, it's a 50% increase. And then you got your challenge again. So I think the trick in my mind is, let's think about prairie dog as being the first money off the table or spent on a project. Then the balance is what we do. And as prairie dog goes up and down, the balance just balances itself. But the ratios are built into your policy. So if it's 10% prairie dog, assessments will go down 10%. And your use of general fund, your other monies will go down 10%. For that project, and those monies then would be left in the individual's pockets at assessments or in the city coffers to do something else. Of 10% of 70% would be a 7% savings for the city's funds that could be used on another project. But you carve it out in a different order so that the sensitivity of change isn't so dramatic to the homeowner and the property owner at the end. Again, I'm not saying 10% is the right number. I don't know enough about the scale of the projects. The other general concern I've got, and when you look at the 10 types of projects, only 3 of them are special assessed in Fargo, if I'm reading the list right. So I don't know that all of it is intended to be for special assessments or not. That's a city policy decision that I don't feel comfortable as part of ours. But those are things that make it even more dynamic, right? On what percentage of the 12 million every year should go to projects that are special. And again, it could be all, would fit the requirements of the law, but it isn't necessarily, I don't know what the conversation is, and I'm not suggesting I need to be part of it, and I don't know the task force should be. But those are all big things, complicated. Again, I'll go back. I think the money should come off. The first discussion is what percent of prairie dog gets applied to what types of projects, and then let the rest of your policy be the policy. And then that benefit flows to everything.
Jim?
Yeah, thank you. And Jeff, I hadn't considered that perspective before, but I'm not liking it, and I'll tell you why. I think that when you get this state money that we're talking about spending, first, I think that that's really a city commission decision, not ours. But I don't like the idea of using it for a specific project, especially rehab, because we're already paying 70% from other taxpayer funds. And the idea of at least using it for arterials, the entire city gets the benefit. Not if it's around for 3 years, then just those people are going to get the benefit of it. And if it's gone, it's hard to identify whether there was a city benefit or if we just favored just the luck of the draw. So that's my concern. And I think that there'll be state money if we spend it wisely. So if we do that, it'd be a good way of maybe getting it to continue. I do believe that, but I'd hate to benefit some taxpayers just because of the timing and where they came up in the rehab process. But ultimately, I do think it's just the city commission's decision on what to do with that money. Don, to your point, I like the idea of saying, hey, let's use this, stop assessing arterials and streetlights and all the chippy things. Stop using specials for that. And then just stop and let the city staff, let the city figure it out. I mean, these are smart people. They can figure out how to finance this stuff. I just think that if our special assessment task force here is to give some recommendations, let's just say that, there's some fatigue from the taxpayers. Let's quit using specials for streetlights for now and these other things that are the adders that no one likes. That's all. Thanks.
Kurt?
I'm going to throw out that we keep talking about the streets all the time, but Kent brought up the fact that the sales tax that's on the books today is split between sewer, water, and the streets. I would like to throw out that sewer and the water are direct connections to every property, right? No different than your electricity or your gas line. The power company in town does not come in and ask for specials to maintain the infrastructure for their equipment, right? So why should we be doing that for water or sewer? That should be part of the bill. I believe that's where Bismarck's going, if I understand it correctly. That's a service charge to maintain that service to your house or your property. If we took that off the table completely and put that in the bill for the water and sewer, like they do with electricity or gas, either one, then we have additional funds we could pull in from the sales tax that's out there today through 2028 or whatever year it is that could help continue to reduce or make them go away, the things we're talking about for roads. The law's in place for the tax that it could be used for any of those. We discussed in an earlier meeting that the city commission is the one that split the percentages, right? So if we took the water and sewer off, that's another $7 million. That's kind of back to what Tony Gehrig was saying early on, is there's money there from the sales tax that could be used for the streets if we found another way to cover the bill for the water and sewer. I think the city needs to look at that as a good option.
Kent, you want to comment on it? Perspective, historical? We love putting you on the spot.
From a historical perspective, we've always used the allocation method to try to create some continuity and sustainability and the ability to do long-term planning in those municipal utilities. So, we have 20-year capital plans, and we need either rate revenue or we need sales tax revenue. So some of that gets planned out over a long horizon. In some cases, too, some of the sales tax may be obligated to debt instruments at this point. So what you're saying is certainly true, that the percentages and the allocations into the individual buckets of sales tax can be moved, but we've always been pretty steadfast in holding them constant because each of those functions is important. Water is important, wastewater is important, streets are important, flood control is important. So an arbitrary shift from year to year in budgeting to move money back and forth is more problematic, we believe, than just putting it into an allocation bucket, if you will, and then stay within your lane and work within your bucket of funding as you move through your capital plans. So the only thing I would caution is you can't spend the money twice. If it's been already pledged for debt, long-term debt instruments, you can't spend it or move it again. Otherwise, then you're just going to be looking for another funding source.
And that's the part that I've always thought through with the discussion, is clean slate moving forward is a clean discussion. The debt on the books from prior is, that's where it gets complicated, how you're gonna start a fee and then cast everything being whole at, day one is just, I don't know if it's under the $25 a month proposal even plausible. Somebody had their hand up? John?
Mr. Chairman, comparing the utility, the electric utility to the water utility, Kurt, it's a fair comparison. And there certainly is a model that can be put together, and the staff could do it, to figure out what utility fees are going to have to be charged. But what you're going to run into is what Mayor Dardis is saying. People do not want to see an absolute increase in their monthly costs. So if you're going to do it with utility fees, what's going to happen is you're going to have to raise your utility fees by X dollars a month to replace those special assessed dollars. That opens up its own can of worms and problems around that, as people on fixed incomes and everything else have similar problems that they have with special assessments. But if we're going to go down that road, and if we look at the proposal that Commissioner Gehrig put forth to do this with utility fees, we have to unwind some very complex situations to do that. And first of all is the underlying debt and the bonds outstanding against special assessments, and that's going to be difficult to do. But then we have the situation of an unfairness to those areas of the community that have paid off or paid down their special assessments. They actually own part of the system, and to make it fair, as I thought about it, the city would need to buy that infrastructure back from the individual property owners if we're going to switch to a fee-based replacement and repair of those things. For greenfields, those greenfields that have outstanding special assessments, we'd have to ask the developer to go and refinance those and pay back the city for that special assessment, which I think is going to have some pretty dramatic changes beyond what we could even imagine here. So as we've gone through this, and I know we continue to kind of spin around the same topics here, I'm wondering if what we could do for the commission from this task force is to put forth those things that we did agree on, that this group looked at and made decisions on, and move that information forward with our recommendations to the commission to consider that in working forward.
Yeah, and just to add to John's comment, roughly a third of single-family homes in Fargo specials are paid off. The point being that if there was a across-the-board fee, we'd be impacting a third of the homeowners in Fargo with another fee that they've already paid for. Let's, Kurt?
That's making the assumption that the fee is for things of the past. The fee is for things going forward, not things of the past. That's to keep the homeowner from getting another $20,000 assessment 10 years from now.
I'd like to move into Gloria's handout and Jeff's, and then the handout that was sent with the information on Friday to you for review of options. Gloria, would you like to walk us through your handout this morning?
Absolutely. Mine were not that far different than Jeff's. Basically, in the greenfields, I think, as I mentioned before, that I would like to see the city reduce the infrastructure that they pay for and just restrict that to the critical infrastructure. Arterial roads, even in the green fields, I like to see that the city, or we have other funding sources for that, whether that comes from cap the residents that live right along that street and have their costs similar to those that are the local or collector street cost, and then the balance to be paid by some other type of funding. Whether that's, we talked about prairie dog, or a utility fee or a sales tax. And establish special assessment caps for current residents in the area. There's always those, when we expand into the green fields and we impact the homeowners that have lived there for many, many years with high special assessments. That's very difficult for those residents to even sell their homes. So if there could be some caps for those. Looking at rehab and reconstruction, the arterial roads again, similar to my recommendation for the green fields is that we find other funding sources for those. And then the local and collector streets for the rehab, we continue at the 70-30 special assessments for that. Those are a cost that all homeowners, even if you live in a rural community, I lived on a farm until I was 40 years old. If the well went out, we paid for it. If the septic went out, we paid for it. So there's a cost for the homeowner, and I just think that is a fair assessment. From an administrative and financial, stop collecting special assessments when the bonds are retired, pass along any interest savings to the residents from bond refinancing, establish income-based reductions for, similar to what we have for property taxes for residents on fixed incomes, and ensure the Prairie Dog funds will be used for city infrastructure and not for the flood control or the FM diversion.
Questions for Gloria? Comments? Jeff?
Gloria, your item 1C, if I'm understanding, that is an example where the city is growing out into an area that has existing homes that probably don't have city services. And as they start to get city services, there really gets to be that conflict of, I've been here a long time, now I'm getting an assessment. That's what that's referring to?
Fact, but I said some caps, not that they shouldn't be assessed something, but some caps. I mean, we heard the stories where some of the homeowners have been assessed, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars on their current homes.
And there's generally some really challenging site conditions that create unique costs. You know, a new greenfield subdivision, your sewer comes in the front, most of the old subdivisions, it goes out the back. So you think about the cost to get around the back of the house, right? We've designed and helped build those. They are really challenging issues. But then it gets to be, so what becomes fair? Why should somebody else pay those, right? And I'm not arguing what you're saying is wrong. It's just what becomes the cap may be a different answer than a typical new development greenfield subdivision. But that's what they're going to compare themselves to, right? But it is an ongoing issue as...
A huge issue for the homeowners in those areas.
Jim?
Gloria, I like your 1B, talking about the arterial streets, having the residents pay something and using the Prairie Dog money for the rest. I think that would probably eliminate most of the issues that the city's seen with the homeowners when new developments have come in, because those homeowners don't get assessed for the local infrastructures. It's when we drag arterials out and they get kind of beat up on that process. So I think your 1B takes care of most of the issues in C. One thing on the greenfield, the first one, 1A, when you talk about limiting the assessments to critical infrastructure, and Jeff's got a very similar program, and that's fine. I guess what I look at from a developer perspective is this city required infrastructure or critical? Because I have this conversation with staff sometimes too, going, hey, look, my idea of critical is a whole lot different than the city's. I would suggest that if we're going to say that we're going to continue to do greenfields, it needs to be any city required infrastructure. Because if the city requires 6-foot sidewalks because they want to connect from point A to point B, I don't want to pay for it. If the city wants a certain streetlights, if they want expensive streetlights because that's the city program, you know, to me, that's not critical. But it may be critical to their maintenance down the road. You know, otherwise, you know, I don't really understand under admin, the financial established income-based reduction. I don't know what that means, but I understand the philosophy there that if the special assessment, I guess on a rehab project only, or are you thinking for Greenfield if someone
Oh,
can?
rehab only.
Right. So if that's the case, we're already paying 70%. I guess I'd leave that to city staff if they can figure out a plan. But those specials on the rehab just aren't that much money in comparison to what the Greenfield people are looking at.
And that would be for people that are on fixed income only.
Right.
The elderly that don't have the resources to take on some special assessments or something like that.
Right, and I know that no one on this task force wants to chase anyone out of their home. So, thanks.
Jeff, do you want to walk us through your sheet?
Absolutely, I'll do that. And I agree with Gloria, it appears our thought concepts were similar. I got a little more granular, and that's probably the engineer in me. Throws a few more numbers on the table, and that's okay. I want to start with one of the challenges, and I think I've said that before in this group, that we really, what's a reasonable assessment, right? And our goal is to reduce assessments, but we've never really had, and I don't know how you determine, what is a reasonable assessment of which we're trying to get to. And so when I hear conversations are too high or those things, it just begs the question, what's the answer? What are we trying to get to as a reasonable assessment? And I don't think we can ever answer that, because I think there's a bunch of it depends. So for me, it's more trying to figure out a way to balance the formulas. The cost is the cost to do these things, and you got to, somehow they got to be paid for. So I kind of broke it into 3 buckets also. I think we're starting to think in the same fashion. One controls costs, then your administrative issues and communications issues. So on the cost side, I started listing what I think is critical infrastructure. I kind of looked at it as things the city has to maintain. If you will, at the end, they own it. I don't know that I picked them all up, and I don't know that I've got too many on there. But my intent was to get to what do you really need for that homeowner business to be viable. Again, street sewer collection, water distribution, to separate it from water treatment, water supply, those things I think fall in a different bucket in my mind. Sidewalks I don't have hard feelings on. I don't even know if you assess them now or not. It's relatively small in the big picture, but again, it's just creating the practice and then doing, either you are or you aren't. Where I think it gets really interesting is street lights and traffic control. I didn't put either of them on there. Again, I'm not familiar with what's happening today in Fargo. And they are 2 completely different things. And so I think those, if they're deemed to be critical, should be on the list, and if they aren't, shouldn't be. I agree with the concern that things keep tailing on, right? And so that's where, for me, it starts to go to the types of streets. The other thing that, in my thinking, when I say local streets, collector streets, it's not only the street, the curb, and the gutter, but the sanitary collection and water that goes with them. I just didn't add those terms, but in my mind, that's part of my thought in the process, okay? So item 2 then, we spent a lot of time talking about the cost of add-ons, engineering, administration. Again, at the end of the day, you just, in my mind, you got to pick a number. I don't think the city's in a position to calculate that number when it's done internally. I can guarantee you, if you try to calculate it, it will be different every project, and you'll go nuts. Because you start to have the conversation, where do you stop counting costs in the city? Is it labor? Is it labor plus benefits? Is it labor plus benefits plus the cost of, you can take those costs and stop wherever you want to. So I think it's more important to just hone in on a number. the balance is going to be paid for out of general funds or some other fund. And so you kind of pick a number. I was kind of approaching it, original construction, in my opinion, costs a little less to design than rehab. It's a little more complicated to come in and get the preliminary work done on rehab than original. So you could have a different fee. Again, with this, I'm just simply pointing out the effort needed to provide the service is a little different on rehab than original, and that's, they could both be the same, but I think you could justify them being different. The administrative, basically, I'm just cutting it a little bit, trying to trim costs. And that was the same thought I had with the original construction for engineering going to 10%. I believe it's going in at 11 now. It's just saves some cost, right? So those two combined, you'd save 2%. It's the savings, right? The difference is going to come out of someplace. When I got to item 3 is where I got quite a bit more granular. And again, I break the concept up into local collectors and arterials. And I hear the arguments, I'm of the opinion 100% of the green fields in front of the house should be assessed. It's a direct benefit to those homes, those properties, and somebody's got to pay the bill if the developer does it. I would ask if it's critical not to do it, why developers aren't. If some developers started doing it themselves and they got the advantage, trust me, they all would do it soon after. And so encourage it. Maybe you even want to, if you encourage it, reduce some of the administrative costs that get added on to the developer doing it themselves. Incentivize it to see what might happen. But I would really be concerned with just all of a sudden stopping it, because I think that would have such a dramatic change in the practice and what people know and understand with assessments now. I could see a scenario where the collector streets then ramp down a little bit on what gets assessed and what comes from other. I threw 60 on the table, more so to just have a number out there, and then this 30, 70 kind of fits the arterial discussion that's been going on for rehab. I could see that being on the front end. Now, the reality on arterials is most of those streets are streets before you build them. You don't come in on a greenfield generally and build a section line road, right? They're mostly there. So you could probably even have an argument if you're taking a county road that's already paved, is that already greenfield? And the reconstruction, the first time the curb and gutter, is that rehab already, right? I don't want to get into that debate here, but with arterials, it's just a different point of beginning, I think, with the improvements. For the rehab reconstruction, if you looked at my math, it's simply assessing half of the original. Again, it's a way to recognize the reconstruction could be absorbed by a different source of funding more so than the greenfield, first time in. And again, if you go down the arterials on 3B3, that by my cut it in half would be only 15% special assessed. It may be collectors and arterials could be the same. I'm just trying to create a conversation that there's a difference. And until we talk about the difference, we're not going to come up with answers. So I threw some ideas on the table to see if it could create a conversation. That's primarily what I was doing with that. But again, it starts to rank them based on what I perceive as the benefit to the lots. The 100% benefit is what's in front of my house. What's kind of a collector is less of a benefit, but I need it. And the arterials, we all need them and got to pay for them somehow. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking with that. On the administrative side, I'm suggesting we consider on original construction increasing the add-on back to 1.5. That is the most riskiest piece of an assessment district because the original construction where you've got empty lots, you've got a far greater chance of default than you do with reconstruction where basically all the lots are built. The odds of a non-payment of assessments there are dramatically less, and you would recognize that risk with a different rate. It's one way to deal with the reality of the risk. So you put the cost where it is. The item 2 of that, for me, though, helps balance that on the greenfield is when the assessment district, when the money is When the bond is, when the interest rates go down, give it to the property owners. Change the rate that you're assessing. Don't lock it in at the beginning. I don't know that that's been a big issue lately because the bonds haven't, I don't know how many refinancing have been done, not a lot. But back in the days when the bonds were 10% and the rates went down to 6%, city changed, right? You refinance, and I think those costs should be passed on to the property owners. I think it's fair and the right thing to do. And I think when the assessment district, the money has been collected, it should stop collecting. When you do that, the 1.5% add-on, if it's not been used, stays with the district. And the property owners that are left at the end get the benefit of it. So you just basically pre-collect maybe the last year, maybe the last 2 years, depending on how the math works. But you leave that benefit with the district of which the cost was assigned to. Then there's not so much heartburn. But when that money goes away, then you start to ask the question, why am I paying for wherever it went, right? So that's where on item, the administrative, I'm really convinced that is the right practice for specials. It gets back to the benefits accrued to those lots, and they should stay with that property of prepayments getting, or the bonds being paid off, and no more collection when there's enough money to do it. Understand that may not be a big dollar amount now, but start to practice when it's not so big, because the days are here when, and they're probably coming again, where it will be a big number as interest rates fall in time. On the communication side, I'm not a communication person, so I did not put a lot down there. I think that's the biggest problem we have. And when it comes to communication, I think there's two groups of people we need to communicate with. One is existing homeowners on what's coming. The other is new residents to the community. What does it mean to have specials? And how do we educate on the why is it important for this community to special assess? I would argue it's the longest standing practice of financing, or it's very long. And I think it is successful. And the question or the challenge is, how do we educate the public on why it's a good thing? I think it saves a lot of money to property owners at the end of the day. So that at a high level is kind of what I was thinking. I had this kind of crafted before the city package came out, and I saw there's a few areas we were the same, and Gloria, yours and mine were similar, but a couple things a little different. But through the whole time, I've been struggling with how do we come to an answer when we don't break it down and talk about the pieces. And so my attempt here was put it in pieces. Each one kind of could be its own answer. One isn't dependent on the other. And then you roll it up and we've got a plan. Thank you.
Kevin?
First of all, thank you, Gloria and Jeff. I think this is where we need to start, is to be able to give the city some options. And so you have some details to kind of discuss the different options. And I think that instead of talking in generalities, because we'll spin that generalities for years if we wanted to. I totally agree with the greenfield, the way you've assessed that. You know, the one thing I would say different about the greenfield is that my experience with homeowners is that whatever we do with the greenfield, it has to be something that's one time. In other words, if I go to buy a new property, I need to know what are my specials going to be. It can't be this, 1 year it's assessed this, and then 2 years something else comes along in 3 years. We need to get to the point where we can say, hey, I'm buying a new property, here's what my specials are going to be. And that's the communication piece and a forward thinking about what are all the costs going to be, so that we can get that homeowner so he doesn't do the surprises. I still would like to see, when it comes to the rehab and reconstruction, at least an option for the city to look at a monthly fee. I think that is something that I see from our homeowners as something of, again, trying to eliminate the surprises. We all pay homeowners insurance. And the reason we do that is nobody wants to have that surprise of a damage to our house, whether it's hailstorm, a fire, whatever it is. We all agree that we're going to pay a monthly fee, and it's a financing mechanism. I'm paying, if your house has damage, some of my money goes to pay for that, and I'm okay with that because that's what it's all about. And I think when it comes to street maintenance, we all know it's going to happen, It's just a matter of when, and how do you, to John's point, somebody's got to pay for it. So how do we finance it? And I like the monthly option is at least being discussed. I know that there's a lot of discussion about how do you migrate to that, how do you go from the existing ones, and I think we could take a look at that. I envision some type of a waiver of credit that's based on, you know, the dollar amount of specials you've been assessed over time. You're able to take that and you could do some kind of formula where if I just got assessed $25,000, I'm gonna get a credit for so long so that I don't pay that monthly fee. I think there's a way you could, won't be totally fair, but at least it'll be something to take a look at it. But at least it should be an option, just like what you and Gloria have presented, gives us a starting point, and I would think as a commissioner, I'd want to have a starting point of saying, okay, here's 3 or 4 different options. We can have a debate on which is the best way to do it.
Jim?
Jeff, I just have a question about your 1% bond interest. When you mentioned that, you said, or my understanding what you're saying is that delta between the interest rate charged by the bond company and that additional, that higher rate, the 1.5, that amount would be used to reduce the outstanding specials at the end, such that if there was no default on a greenfield project or whatever project, that delta would be applied towards the specials and not be just used for city funds.
Well, my understanding today, the percent that you pay now goes into the sinking fund.
Right.
That extra percent. It doesn't go into the general fund. It goes into the sinking fund, correct?
Correct.
So the sinking fund is getting larger faster than the bond payments, provided everybody's paying their assessment, right, and the math is working. All I'm saying is that 1% came from those homeowners.
Mm-hmm.
If you stop collecting when the bonds are paid off, they got the benefit of it. The lots did. Now, the person who paid the bill, I think it's crazy to try to go and say, well, we got to get it back to the person who paid the extra percent year one. That math, you know, you'll never get there. But so a 25-year bond issue, you might pay off in 23.
Right, and that's what I'm getting at, is you're suggesting that money be used for that project, not
Absolutely.
for specials across them. Okay.
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say this for the record, I agree with Jeff on this instance.
Can we mark
Write
that one
that
down
down.
here?
The minutes will reflect that Mr. Bolus agrees with Mr. Volk. Suggestion, I am going to recommend that we blend Jeff and Gloria's paper into the sheet that was sent Friday as the document to move forward on. So all discussions today, including draft of the discussions from our previous meetings that was sent to you Friday, Gloria and Jeff's would all be combined into one document. Looking at Mayor Mahoney, as I noted earlier, we're in the middle of his budget at the city to approve by October 1st. And I'd like to ask him for any comments. I would like to see us, once this is blended, we'll send it back to everyone. We're going to have some time for city staff to work on coming up with, solutions for the recommendations. And in my world, we should have that approved in a policy amendment to the infrastructure policy by the end of September. So when the budget for 2020 operating budget's approved, so is the special assessment infrastructure policy. So they come together at the same time.
First of all, I want to thank you all for your hard work. It's kind of watching this committee, all the different things you've gone through and all the things you've seen. It's kind of fun, at least at the end, to get some recommendations and ideas of what you're thinking to go. I think we have to look at the financial ramifications of some of the options that you will give us, and I think Kent's going to have to look at that. So there's some things I think, yeah, easily you could do, some you could kind of debate. And once we've done that, we should be able to do that. Prairie dog funds are going to make an impact. I don't, $13 million a year is going to make an impact, and how can we fairly do that? We just had to challenge the engineering crew a little bit about how do you do it fairly, because north side, south side, east side, west side, does everybody get the same reduction? Does everybody get the same benefit? Definitely in all the public which forms we went, arterial is a big issue. It's really a big issue. We can see some free reductions when we talk to Kent about it. Going from 1% to 0.75 probably is doable because we don't have a lot of defaults in our community. So those types of little adjustments could be made, and it's a question in administrative engineering, can you make those adjustments as well, looking at past history. But I definitely think your hard work is going to help us shape a different ideas and different things in that. So I just really want to thank you for your hard work and for giving us recommendations. It's hard to sort through all this. And if I asked everybody in the room, hey, do you like to pay taxes? Nobody really likes to pay taxes, but we have to figure that out and try to keep them as low as possible. And to Tony's point, we just looked at the budget. The city's growing, it's getting bigger, and we continue to have growth, and that's good. But can we do it in a fashion in which is acceptable to our people who live here? So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. And I would expect as well, moving forward with that timeline, if that's what we are able to accomplish, that this will probably be revisited again, particularly with the pilot going on in Bismarck, any other changes in legislation that allows us more latitude. So this isn't going to come to an end, I don't believe, in the next couple of months. It's going to be an ongoing, continuous improvement with maybe factoring in additional state resources potentially to changes that are going on in other communities. I would like to ask one question, everyone, and both mayors are here. In your opinion, and there's a specific reason that Mayor Dardis was asked to be part of this, because we are one community. We have political boundaries, city boundaries between Fargo and West Fargo, but we are one community for all practical purposes. And as you're aware, City of West Fargo is going through the same process. Mayor Dardis alluded earlier that they're watching us. How important it is to you that the decisions we make at the City of Fargo are in sync with the City of West Fargo, so there's a common policy within our one community, I'll use that word, so that we're working together. I can tell you as one city commissioner, that's very important to me. Fargo has economies of scale. We're providing wastewater and water, and there's a true partnership between our two communities. And I think that's important to recognize, and I think your opinion would be helpful to understand as we move forward, particularly with Mayor Dardis's leadership in West Fargo and where we end up coming together with Mayor Mahoney and our efforts. So, thoughts?
Mr. Chairman, old-time politics, there was Fargo and West Fargo. As our community has grown and what we've seen with both communities, I think the majority of the people I talk to think about North Fargo, South Fargo, Fargo, and West Fargo as one community. And sure, they're governed differently and they have different political subdivisions, but what we do as a whole, I think, is the entire community. It would be nice to have sort of a continuity between those things. And so sometimes, though, and I've been thinking about the comments about special assessment insurance instead of homeowners insurance, maybe there is a private sector solution to it. Maybe it is with the home mortgage opportunity that as specials come, that they can be paid off on a home equity line of credit. So there may be creative solutions around things. Really from the standpoint of not confusing the population any more than we already have, I think it'd be great if we could find commonality in how we approach this between our communities.
Kevin?
Just strictly from a lending point of view, absolutely, I think it'd be really important to have that similarity. As you know, the lender in most cases is responsible for collecting those on a monthly basis to be able to pay the taxes for individuals, and so having to okay, which community is it, how do they do it, would really be a logistically a nightmare, I think that would be important.
Mayor Dardis?
I appreciate all your comments about, the two communities together, because I certainly feel that way. There are some differences, though, with the economy of scale, as Commissioner Grinberg said. As I watch this process and participated in this process, I would like very much to have the same amount of sales tax money that the city of Fargo has, because, you know, when Mayor Mahoney has addressed this, or Mr. Costin has addressed this many, many times, they're able to take X number of dollars of that sales tax and use it as a revenue source to buy things down. And we don't have that luxury. You know, we have approximately $10 million available each year that's not committed of sales tax dollars to do that type of thing. So we will do everything that we can to be a good neighbor as we continue on with our process. You have our word on that, and I have been amazed in the 1 year that I've been in an elected capacity, is the amount of meetings that the Fargo City staff and the West Fargo City staff have together. And I think that is extremely positive and says a great deal about the individuals that are involved. But City of Fargo has been a great team player with us, and we will continue to do the same thing. So I appreciate all your comments, and I would do everything that I can in my power to make sure that that is a reality, that we work as one community when dealing with this very important issue.
Jeff?
I agree with Mayor Dardis's comments. I think at the high level, two communities should be similar in that, are we going to assess or not, right? That's a huge thing that would be different from community to community. Once you get a little deeper in the weeds, I don't know that it's that critical that maybe if there's a different, if West Fargo feels there should be a different cost share and ratios, that's where I keep coming back to the methodology being similar. And then the cities have to do their own math, because you got to balance, you got to pay for the projects, right? The pace of infrastructure replacement in West Fargo is different than Fargo. It is. And so you can't be taking all those things and pigeonholing them into the same answer. But again, the same high-level concept, I think, is what's important.
Additional comments? Moving forward then, we'll combine this document, send it to you. You'll be kept up to date as staff works through this, certainly with recommendations that will come from staff as a result of your hard work will also be shared as we move forward with final determination at City Commission level. And another thought, Jeff?
Are we going to talk a little bit about the pieces that came out? I've got a couple thoughts, if I may.
Please.
Item 1 on administrative number 5, I disagree that the issue is bid deadlines. I think the challenge is completion dates is what drives the cost, not so much, obviously when you bid it is a factor, but I think you have to talk about what are reasonable completion dates, because if you have unreasonable completion dates, the cost goes up. Now, I understand when, in a greenfield scenario, there's input from the developer and from the city, and there's different issues that have to be resolved. But I would just challenge the thought of you look at the completion as a bigger driver of cost than the start, because if those two don't match up right, they are going to be expensive. The other item that I thought was interesting was 2.8, create an age of infrastructure heat map. That would be a real interesting map. I would wonder, what will the result of real estate value be when that map gets published, right?
Yes.
Because the hot spots, the value of the real estate's going to probably go down.
Absolutely.
Which speaks to why assessments are the right answer, because it goes directly to the quality of the infrastructure, drives the value of the property. And so as you improve the infrastructure, the value goes up. But again, I think it would be a real interesting map, but I think you want to be careful on a possible negative outcome. Might be challenging and difficult for those who own lots on that hotspots.
There, yes.
Right. I was curious, Gloria, how you were going to react to that, because that was my first reaction is,
Yeah, that would, I don't know that that would be a good idea because of the risk to the homeowners in those areas.
If the city comes along and assesses the property accordingly, it might be a benefit to the homeowner because their property taxes might go down more than equal. I mean, there's always a flip side. We can't be afraid to change. I've heard that all along here, that everybody is afraid to change. That drives me nuts. We got to change at some point.
I don't know that providing a heat map of where things are going to be special assessed, that will, it'll impact the homeowners in those areas, in my opinion, more so than benefit them.
You're making the assumption that the people are looking at the heat map.
True.
That's not a good assumption with a lot of home buyers.
Real estate agents will.
They don't always tell their buyers everything.
Interesting. Jim?
I just want to again echo the Jeff Volk comment about 1.5. I think that staff does a good job with establishing their own deadlines on bidding stuff. They don't need our input on how to do their job in that regard. They're certainly capable of figuring out when to bid it and do lead times. We've had good success with working with city staff on rebidding things and adjusting deadlines to try and get lower costs. I think that they're doing a great job the way it is in that regard. So we don't need 1.5.
Sure. No, I'm thinking about the heat map still, sorry. I'm on the Kurt side on this as far as transparency and how that syncs with a CIP plan, so people are fully aware of the aging infrastructure and the plan of the city to address it.
Mr. Chairman, the heat map already exists. It's the age of the homes. And if you go to an older section of town, buyers that are paying attention, and Curtis, I agree, they don't always pay attention, but will understand and will explain, hey, we've already had special assessments, we have new infrastructure. Or if you're looking at that, the question you should be asking yourself. So I think it can have an impact, but it's also going to help staff as they're doing the long-range capital improvement plans, saying, here's where things are coming. And again, with the special assessment, where the benefit ties to the property, the fact that you're going to upgrade your infrastructure in the house certainly is going to be reflected in the price of the house, just like having a new roof on the house or a new furnace or the sidewalk or the driveway replaced or any of those things. So I agree. I think more information, the better, and we'll kind of let the market adjust a little bit to it.
If I can just follow, I like the concept. My concern is potential negative outcome. Again, I just sort out, I'm going, okay, it helps explain why the quality of infrastructure is a direct relationship to the value of the property. There is a connection, and that's the whole theory behind special assessments. And so I think that's why they work so good, is the two are directly connected. And this would demonstrate it if the outcome of values of those properties would drop simply because the map was published. And I don't know that it will. It could be a potential outcome. So it would just have to be used wisely.
Jim?
Yeah, I think what John said is probably sufficient. I don't think we need a heat map for this. My fear would be that if you have a heat map and then you have a need to replace some infrastructure someplace that's not on that you're going to have a bunch of people in front of the city commissions claiming that they relied on this heat map and that therefore the city should be giving them some tax relief. I mean, I think I think there could be some unintended consequences to providing that type of information. That's just my 2 cents.
I didn't think we'd close with heat map discussions. Further comments? We have a plan. I sincerely appreciate your dedication and focus and patience with our efforts. It is so noted by city staff, Mayor Mahoney, who has left, and the City Commission. We appreciate the effort. I firmly believe we will make a substantive change to benefit homeowners and taxpayers in Fargo as a result of your efforts. And just want to express my gratitude. So thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Your second?
Second.
Discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed, same sign. We are adjourned.